Everybody, welcome back. So let's start with Hibernate. It's a new session, it's a new chapter, it's a new topic actually. So we'll start with Hibernate, but before going on to Hibernate, I just want to have a look at the drawbacks of Jdbc. Okay, so in order to overcome some of the problems of Jdbc, we have Hibernate in scenario. That is the place where Hibernate came into picture. So in Jdbc, if you want to open a connection, you must have remembered, if you want to open a connection and connect to the database, so you have to write those code in a try catch block, right? So, and if any exception is occurring, so you have to write a catch block, and then finally you have to close the connection. So here as a programmer, you must close the connection, that's right, or we may get a chance to get out of the connection messages. Actually, if you don't close the connection in the finally block, then Jdbc is not responsible to close that connection, correct? So this is how it happens in Jdbc. We write simple SQL commands in various places, right? And if the table structure is modified, then the Jdbc program doesn't work. Actually, if you modify the table structure, Jdbc will not work. It would ultimately throw an exception, or some error will occur. Okay, so in some of the application, in some of the high-end application, the data flow within an application from class to class will be in the form of objects. But while we store data finally in database using Jdbc, that will be converted into a text, because Jdbc doesn't transfer those objects directly to the database. So this is where Hibernate came to picture. So what is Hibernate? What Hibernate is doing, Hibernate is basically an ORM tool. So if you want to transfer the data between Java objects and within an application and a database in the form of objects, if the interaction needs to happen in the form of objects, Hibernate is the solution. So Hibernate is an open source lightweight tool. Actually, a JBoss actually it's owned by JBoss, I guess, if I'm not wrong. Okay, so it won't force the programmer to extend any class or interface. We have to what we all need to do is we need to write Pojo classes, and that's it. Hibernate is purely persistent. It will persist those objects into the database. Persist means it will just store or retrieve the data. Okay, so this is all about Hibernate, a basic introduction. So advantages of Hibernate includes, it's very fast, the queries are very fast, database independent query, you can plug into Hibernate to any of the database vendors, specific databases, Oracle, MySQL, H2, any of the database. You do not need to write an extra code. Automatic creation, table deletion, and all those things you can do. It simplifies the complex joins. If you have any join in between two tables, you can do that in Hibernate. And performance wise, it's very fast. You can have a caching facility. You can do a caching over using Hibernate. And most important thing, it's open source and very light. So let's talk about the Hibernate architecture. So Hibernate architecture includes many persistent objects, such as a Sessionfactory and all those things. So it includes Sessionfactory, Transaction Factory, Connection Factory, Session Transaction, etc. So suppose I have my application over here. So let's assume my application stays right somewhere below, like this. This is my application, okay? And in between, I have my persistent object. This is my persistent object, and this is the Hibernate framework. Okay, so what does Hibernate framework includes? So Hibernate includes all the mapping and configuration files basically. In this stage, all the Hibernate configurations and mapping files. Mappings are provided, and ultimately what it does, it interacts with the database. So somewhere below the line I have my database over here. So this is how Hibernate architecture looks in short. Database, yeah, correct. Okay, so if any Java application wants to interact with Hibernate, and Hibernate directly interacts with the database. So Java application doesn't need to interact directly with the database. Okay, we have there's lots of elements of Hibernate, Sessionfactory, session, transaction, connection provider, transaction factory. So basically we'll deal with Sessionfactory. So Sessionfactory lies in between somewhere here in the Hibernate. So what does Sessionfactory do? Sessionfactory is nothing but a factory of sessions. Okay, a kind of client connection provider. It holds the second level cache of data. It has many factory method to get the objects on session, So, and there is something known as session. And what session does, object provides an interface between the application and the data stored in the database. It is very short lifespan is very short, and wraps the JDBC connection. The JDBC connection is basically wrapped over it. You can use transaction, you can use query, you can use criteria. There is something known as criteria, all those things. Okay, so it's under the package org.hibernate.session, the interface, session interface. It has methods to insert, update, delete. It also has some factory methods related to transaction, query processing, transaction and query, and criteria. There is something known as criteria API. We'll talk about it later. There is something known as transaction object. The transaction object specifies that at one time it handles only one operation. It's optional actually. It's under the package org.hibernate.transaction. Okay, so there is something known as connection provider as well, and transaction factory. So these are simple things. You just need not to worry about it. So let's go into more depth. Let's start with creating an application. So we will go with Hibernate application using an IDE. So in my case I will be using Eclipse. So you can use any of the IDE you want. So the first thing I will do is I will download the Hibernate jars. If I even download the Hibernate jars, if you go to hibernate.org, I think, I'm not sure, but just Google it. You can get the Hibernate jars from Hibernate website. Okay, so if you go to hibernate.org.org downloads, you can get the Hibernate jar. You can take the latest jar and download it. So I have my jars downloaded over here. So this is the Hibernate jar. Okay, so it has some required jars and all those things. I got to test live. This is the required jars that I need. Apart from that, there are some optional and all other clustering jars and all those things. We'll use as per we need it, but so just let's start. So what I will do, I will just create a Pojo object and employee Pojo table, Pojo object, and then we'll persist that Pojo object into my database. So I have my Pojo object created like this. Employee class, I have setters and getters including the first name and last name method global variables. So, and the most important thing that you need to know is you have to have a hibernate.cfg.xml file. But before going on to hibernate.cfg.xml, I would just like to show you how I have included my jars. So you have to include your jars to the Java build path, and then just, if you go add external jar, go browse through the place where we have downloaded your jar and add it to the project. So I'll just add it. Sorry, okay, because I will just populate all the required jars, and some optional jars are there. All those things I will put over there. So if you go to my project, you can see what is the required jar that I have used actually. So these are the jars that I basically need. You can check the list over there and add accordingly. Okay, so and I am using MySQL as my database vendor specific database, so I am using MySQL connector over here. You can use any of the database you want, and I have my employee hbm.xml, so I'll talk about it a bit later, but just let's start with creating the Pojo object. So if you right click on your class, in your package src, new class, and you can create this class using, you can create over here, right, like this, right click, new package, and inside package you can have your class. So after you have created your Pojo and persistent class, you need to create a mapping file for this persistent class, right? So to create the mapping file, right click on the src. So see this mapping file, how you can create this mapping file. So the first step is I have created the persistent class. Second step is I will create the mapping file for the persistent class, right? So the mapping file should be conventionally, the naming should be like, first you have the class name. So my class name is employee, the Pojo name basically the employee, and then we'll give .hbm.xml. There are many elements many elements over here, such as Hibernate mapping. This is the root element in the mapping file. This one is the root element. There is something known as class. I need to map my class. I need to tell Hibernate which is the class that's going to act as a persistent object. So org.choristers.employee is a class. I have given the name. The name is ampl. I have given a generator over here. So id is the sub element of a class. It specifies the primary key attribute in that class, right? So this is the primary key attribute. I need to have some primary key for my table, right? So this is what I have added as a primary key. So I will have something known as generator. So generator is nothing but it's the sub element of that id. I will have some logic that will define how will this id will get generated. It may be automatically getting generated, or we can configure it, whatever. There are many generator classes provided by Hibernate, such as incremental, sequence. We'll learn the generator classes later, but let's, for now we'll write like this. So there are some properties. So property is the sub element of the class that specifies the property of that persistent class. So my persistent class here is employee, and what are the properties over here? First name and last name. These are the two properties that will be mapped as a table column, a column for this table employee. So my table name would be EMPL, and the column name would be first name and last name, right? These are the properties that I am telling Hibernate to configure. So after I have configured my property, I will create the configuration file, that is the connection file basically. So the connection file is something, the naming convention would be something like hibernate.cfg.xml. I have created hb2ddl.auto. The DDL should be generated automatically. If the table is not there, it will by default create the table. Okay. So I have given my driver class name. As I am using MySQL, I need to have the driver class name, the database password, the database URL, the database username, and the dialect. As I am using MySQL, I will be using MySQL dialect. Okay, I just want to see the SQLs, the getting generated to, so I will set it to true. And there is something known as mapping resource. So what is the resource that I am pointing? So my resource is employee.hbm.xml, so it will automatically pick up the employee class and persist it. Okay, so now I will write some method to to persist my values. I will create the class that stores some object. Right, so this is, so I will create an object of the configuration. There is configuration object I need to create, and I need to pass the configuration file name. So I have passed my configuration file name as hibernate.cfg.xml that we have created earlier. Okay, the configuration file is present. Then what I've done, I have created an object of Sessionfactory, so it will start a session. So the Sessionfactory object is created, and then I have opened the session. The session is open, and now I can begin the transaction. So what is my transaction? My transaction would be something like Sessionfactory session.save, or what is session.persist you can use. So I have persisted my employee class. Okay, and then I will commit the transaction and close the session. So this is how a basic setup you can do. So if I run the application, so let's take an example. I have created 888. So I'll just run the application for now. See, you can see over there I have given my property as show SQL as true, so it's showing my SQL over there. What is the SQL that's getting generated, right? So let's check what is the I have given in my URL, the test, the employee MPL class. I can see over there the ID is getting inserted, the first name with the last name. Okay, so this is how a basic Hibernate configuration works actually. So guys, thank you for watching it, the basic setup. Thanks for liking. Thank you.